Oliver Carter was just 8 years old, but he was running out of time. A life-saving surgery could give him a future, but the hospital refused to help. Because he was homeless. His mother's desperate pleas went unheard, and hope was slipping away. But then, Big Shaq stepped in, and what happened next changed everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The biting wind howled through the streets of New York City, sending shivers down the spine of anyone caught outside. People hurried past, bundled in warm coats and scarves, too busy or too indifferent to notice the small bundle of blankets near the subway entrance. Beneath them, an 8-year-old boy, Oliver, sat curled up against his mother, Rachel, his tiny body trembling with fever. Rachel, only 28 but worn down by years of struggle, clutched Oliver tightly, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure were true. "Just hold on, baby. We're going to be okay." But deep down, she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep that promise. Her son's face was pale, his blue eyes dull and glassy, his breathing labored. Every few minutes, his small body convulsed in a cough so deep it seemed to rattle his fragile ribs. He was running out of time. Rachel hadn't always been homeless. 2 years ago, she had a stable job as a nurse and a small apartment where Oliver had his own bed. But after her husband's sudden death in a car accident, the medical bills, funeral costs, and rent crushed her like a tidal wave. She tried everything, working double shifts, selling their belongings, taking out loans. But then Oliver got sick. A rare congenital heart defect. Life-threatening. The doctors told her he needed surgery before it was too late. The cost? $85,000. Money she never had and never would. She had tried every program, every charity, every hospital. Each time, she was met with the same response. "I'm sorry, but without insurance or upfront payment, we can't proceed." Now, with only 48 hours left before Oliver's body would give up, Rachel stood outside the very hospital that once employed her, begging for help. A security guard frowned as she approached. "Ma'am, you can't stand here." "Please," she sobbed. "My son, he's dying." The guard's face softened for a split second, but protocol trumped compassion. "I'm sorry. There's nothing we can do." Rachel's knees buckled. She clutched Oliver to her chest, his shallow breaths pressing weakly against her arm. She had failed him. A sleek black SUV rolled to a stop nearby, its tinted windows shielding its passengers from the harsh city scene. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Shaquille O'Neal, towering like a giant among the crowd. Dressed casually in a hoodie and sweatpants, Shaq had only meant to grab a quick bite before heading home. But the sight of a woman crying on the freezing pavement, holding a sick child, while people ignored them, made his stomach twist. He watched as Rachel buried her face in Oliver's thinning hair, rocking him slightly. Her shoulders shook, as if she was trying to shield him from a world that didn't care. Shaq wasn't the type to ignore things like this. Something in his gut told him to step in. As he approached, Rachel noticed a massive shadow looming over her. Fear flashed in her tired eyes as she looked up, expecting another security guard to chase her away. Instead, she saw concern. Genuine, human concern. "Hey," Shaq said softly. "What's going on?" Rachel hesitated. Who would believe a homeless woman's story? Would he just shake his head and walk away like the rest? She didn't have time for doubts. "My son, he needs surgery," she choked out. "The hospital won't take him. I don't have the money." Shaq glanced at Oliver. One look at the boy's condition told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't an exaggeration. This wasn't a scam. This was a mother about to lose her child. Shaq crouched down to Oliver's level, his massive hands gentle as he reached out. "Hey, little man," he said, his voice warm. "I'm Shaq. What's your name?" Oliver stirred weakly, barely able to lift his head. "Oh, Oliver," he whispered. Shaq's heart sank at the frailness of his voice. He turned back to Rachel, his expression unreadable. "Come with me." Rachel blinked, confused. "What?" Shaq stood up, pulling out his phone. "We're getting your son the help he needs." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Was this real? Shaq dialed a number. "Derek, I need you to get my medical team on the line. and find out why the hell this hospital is turning away a dying kid. Rachel covered her mouth, overwhelmed. For the first time in a long time, someone wasn't just walking past. For the first time, they had hope. And Oliver might just have a chance. The warmth of the diner was a stark contrast to the freezing streets Rachel and Oliver had just come from. The scent of fresh coffee and grilled food filled the air, but Rachel barely noticed. She sat stiffly across from Shaquille O'Neal, still processing what had just happened. Minutes ago, she had been begging outside a hospital, convinced her son was about to die in her arms. Now, she was sitting in front of an NBA legend, watching as he ordered a meal for them like it was just another Tuesday. Oliver, too weak to sit up straight, leaned against Rachel's side. A steaming plate of pancakes sat in front of him, but he only managed a few small bites. Rachel clutched the warm coffee mug Shaq had placed in front of her. Her fingers shook, not from the cold, but from exhaustion, fear, and a lifetime of holding everything in. Shaq watched her, his expression unreadable but his eyes full of concern. "You want to tell me what's going on?" he asked gently. Rachel's grip on the mug tightened. For a moment, pride held her back. She had spent so long fighting, surviving, keeping her pain hidden from the world. But now, she had nothing left to lose. And for the first time, someone was actually listening. Taking a shaky breath, she whispered, "Oliver was supposed to have surgery 3 weeks ago." Shaq's brows furrowed. 3 weeks? Rachel nodded, her voice breaking. "We had a date. We had a plan. I scraped together every penny I could, but it wasn't enough." She pulled a crumpled stack of hospital papers from her coat pocket, laying them on the table with trembling hands. Shaq picked them up, scanning through the printed words. The medical terminology didn't mean much to him, but one line stood out immediately. "Surgery canceled. Payment not received." Shaq's jaw tightened. "Wait, you're telling me the hospital scheduled his surgery and then just canceled it?" Rachel nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't even find out until the morning of," she whispered. "We showed up that day, thinking they were going to save him. But instead, they told me to leave." Shaq's stomach twisted. "They refused to help a dying kid?" His voice was dangerously low. Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "Hospitals don't care about dying kids, not if they're poor." Shaq felt his fists clench under the table. He had seen a lot of unfairness in the world. Poverty, injustice, people being denied basic rights. But this was a new level of cruelty. "They were just going to let him die?" he said, his voice rough. Rachel wiped at her eyes. "A nurse. A kind one, the only one who actually cared, pulled me aside that day. She told me the truth." Shaq leaned in, sensing that what she was about to say next would be even worse. Rachel swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "She said Oliver doesn't have more than 2 days left." Silence. Shaq's stomach dropped. He glanced at Oliver, curled up next to his mother, barely awake, barely moving. 2 days? Shaq exhaled sharply, his massive hands pressing against the table. That wasn't going to happen, not on his watch. He looked Rachel straight in the eye, his voice calm but firm. "You're not going to lose him." Rachel blinked at him, almost too afraid to believe it. "How?" she asked, her voice small, broken. Shaq reached for his phone, already scrolling through his contacts. "Because I'm about to make some calls." Shaq wasn't the type to wait around when lives were on the line. As soon as Rachel finished telling him about the hospital's refusal, he pulled out his phone and called Derek, his trusted assistant. "Get Alicia on the line," Shaq ordered. Alicia was more than just a legal expert. She was a shark in the courtroom, a woman who could tear apart policies and expose loopholes with surgical precision. If anyone could force the hospital to admit Oliver, it was her. Within minutes, Alicia was on the phone. "The hospital already rejected them," Shaq said, frustration creeping into his voice. "Find out why, and don't stop until you get me an answer." Alicia didn't hesitate. "On it." While Shaq stayed with Rachel and Oliver, Alicia started digging. She called hospital administrators, searched through public records, and followed the money. And what she found was sickening. Alicia called Shaq back an hour later, her voice sharp and urgent. Shaq, I found something. Talk to me, Shaq said. The hospital has a charity fund, millions set aside for cases just like Oliver's, Alicia explained. It should have covered his surgery. Shaq's stomach tightened. Then why didn't it? Alicia hesitated before saying the name. Dr. Kenneth Wallace. Shaq leaned forward. Who the hell is Dr. Wallace? The hospital's CEO. Alicia's tone darkened. He's been stealing from that charity fund for years, every donation meant for sick children. Wallace pocketed most of it. Rachel, sitting across from Shaq, gasped. That's why they turned us away? Alicia confirmed it. If Oliver got treatment, it would have raised questions about where the charity funds were really going. Wallace couldn't afford that kind of attention. Shaq's jaw clenched. This wasn't just about hospital policies. This was pure evil. Shaq didn't waste a second. He stormed into the hospital, his presence alone commanding attention. The security guards, recognizing him, hesitated. No one wanted to be the idiot who tried to stop Shaquille O'Neal. Straight to the top floor. Straight into Dr. Wallace's office. The CEO, a slick, well-dressed man in his late 50s, sat behind a massive desk, flipping through paperwork as if nothing was wrong. He barely glanced up when Shaq entered. Well, well, Wallace said smoothly, smirking. I was wondering how long it would take before you showed up. Shaq slammed both hands on the desk, making the framed awards on the wall rattle. Oliver Carter, Shaq growled. 8 years old, dying, and you turned him away. Wallace chuckled, leaning back in his chair. I don't make the rules, Mr. O'Neal. I simply enforce them. Shaq's fists tightened. You have charity funds. The surgery should have been paid for. Wallace shrugged. And? Shaq narrowed his eyes. And you stole from it. The smirk on Wallace's face didn't fade. If anything, he seemed amused. Let's say I did, Wallace said slowly. What exactly are you going to do about it? Shaq felt rage boiling in his chest. He had dealt with entitled, arrogant men before. But this was different. This man wasn't just cruel. He enjoyed it. You can pay for one surgery, Wallace continued, his voice dripping with condescension. But what about the others? There are thousands of homeless kids out there, Mr. O'Neal. You going to save all of them? Shaq's hands shook with fury. I'll start with Oliver. Wallace's smile widened. Not happening. Shaq stilled. What did you say? Wallace folded his hands neatly on the desk. Even if you pay, I won't approve the surgery. Shaq's breath hitched. Why? Wallace's expression turned cold. We decide who gets help. For the first time in his life, Shaquille O'Neal felt true hatred. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about rules. Wallace was playing God. And he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Shaq stormed out of Wallace's office, his pulse thundering in his ears. He had never felt this kind of fury before. Not on the court, not in business. This was different. This was life and death. Rachel clutched Oliver's frail body, rocking him as he struggled to breathe. His tiny fingers were ice cold in her hands. Shaq turned to Derek. Call every top hospital in this city. I don't care what it costs. Derek didn't hesitate. He started dialing. Minutes later, Alicia pulled up a name. St. Jude Memorial Hospital. They have a pediatric cardiac unit, Alicia said, urgency in her voice. They can do the surgery. Shaq grabbed his phone. This is Shaquille O'Neal, he said the moment the chief surgeon answered. I'll donate $100,000 to your hospital. Right now, if you take in a little boy who's about to die. The surgeon hesitated. Sir, we don't. Do not tell me no. Shaq's voice was steel. I'll wire the money this second, just save the kid. A beat of silence. Then, send him now. Shaq exhaled sharply and turned to Rachel. We got a hospital. Rachel collapsed into sobs, clutching Oliver tighter. Then Shaq made the next call. Send an ambulance. Now. The ambulance screeched to a halt in front of the hospital, sirens wailing. Paramedics rushed out, grabbing Oliver's fragile body from Rachel's arms. Rachel stumbled forward, but a nurse caught her. He's in good hands. We have to move fast. Shaq's heart hammered as he followed them inside. Everything moved in a blur. Doctors, nurses, flashing monitors, everyone scrambling. Oliver was placed on a stretcher, an oxygen mask pressed to his face. His small chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven gasps. A doctor called out, "Prepping for surgery." But then, the unthinkable happened. "He's crashing!" Shaq's blood ran cold. Oliver's tiny body jerked violently, his limbs twitching. Machines blared, red lights flashing. A nurse shouted, "No pulse!" Rachel screamed, "No! Please save him!" Doctors rushed around him, one performing CPR, another grabbing a defibrillator. Shaq stood frozen as he watched Oliver's body convulse. This little boy who had already suffered so much. He had saved him from the streets. He had saved him from Wallace. But now, he was losing him anyway. For the first time in his life, Shaq felt truly powerless. This wasn't something he could fix with money. This wasn't something he could fight his way through. All he could do was watch. Rachel collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "Please, baby, stay with me." Shaq clenched his fists, every muscle in his massive frame tensed with helpless rage. "Clear!" The defibrillator shocked Oliver's tiny body. Shaq held his breath. The monitor stayed flat. No heartbeat. Shaq's chest tightened. Rachel's sobs grew uncontrollable. The doctor's face hardened. Again. Another shock. The longest second of Shaq's life. Then, a beep. Then another. A weak, fragile heartbeat. The room exhaled in relief. Rachel screamed in joy. Shaq closed his eyes, his entire body sagging as if he had just played the hardest game of his life. Oliver was still here, but he wasn't safe yet. The surgery was about to begin. The climactic showdown, Shaq fights back. 800 words. The hospital room was filled with urgency. Oliver lay on the operating table, his tiny chest rising and falling weakly under the harsh surgical lights. His heart was failing, and the doctors knew it. A surgeon turned to Shaq and Rachel, his voice grim. "He won't survive another 24 hours without this surgery." Rachel squeezed Oliver's hand, her lips trembling. "Then why are we waiting?" The doctor sighed. "Because we need legal clearance." Shaq stiffened. "Legal clearance? Are you kidding me?" The surgeon shook his head. "The first hospital, Wallace's hospital, refused treatment. Since he was registered there, we need clearance or risk a lawsuit for unauthorized surgery." Rachel gasped. "They're seriously going to let my son die over paperwork?" Shaq's jaw tightened. This wasn't just bureaucracy. This was power being used to control life and death, and he was done playing by their rules. Shaq turned to Alicia. "How fast can we take them down?" Alicia's eyes flashed with determination. "Give me an hour." She pulled out her phone and got to work, reaching out to reporters, lawyers, and state officials. Within minutes, she filed an emergency lawsuit against Wallace's hospital. The accusation? Medical negligence and corruption. But that wasn't enough. Shaq knew exposing them privately wouldn't work, so he took it public. Shaq went live on social media. His voice was raw, his usual calmness replaced with controlled fury. A hospital, one that's supposed to save lives, just denied a dying boy his only chance to survive. He held up Oliver's medical records. They had the funds, they had the resources, they just didn't care. Rachel, standing beside him, sobbed silently. "This is my son," she whispered. "They left him to die, and they will do it to others." Shaq's words struck a nerve. Within minutes, #JusticeForOliver was trending nationwide. Protesters flooded the streets outside Wallace's hospital, holding signs that read, "People over profits. Hospitals shouldn't decide who deserves to live. Arrest doctor." Wallace. News stations picked up the story. Shaq's post hit millions of views in under an hour. Wallace's hospital was under siege, and now they were running out of time. Inside his penthouse office, Dr. Kenneth Wallace stared at the news broadcast, his face pale. His phone exploded with calls. The hospital board, government officials, investors. They all had the same message. "Fix this." Now his secretary rushed in, looking panicked. "Sir, the board is demanding your resignation." Wallace's stomach dropped. "No." He shook his head. "I built this hospital. They don't care, she interrupted. They're saying if you don't step down, they'll hand over evidence to the authorities. Wallace felt a cold sweat form on his forehead. This wasn't just a scandal anymore. This was a career-ending disaster. But before he could say another word, security walked in. You need to leave, one of them said. Now. Wallace's mouth went dry. His empire was gone. Back at the hospital, Shaq's phone buzzed. Alicia grinned, holding up a signed document. The hospital board fired Wallace. She handed it to the surgeon. You have clearance. Start the surgery. Rachel broke down in tears. Shaq let out a shaky breath, finally feeling hope. Doctors rushed Oliver into surgery. Shaq watched as the doors swung shut. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time, they had a fighting chance. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the hospital hallway as Oliver was wheeled into the operating room. Rachel stood frozen, her knuckles white as she clutched Shaq's hand. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "If he doesn't make it, thank you for trying." Shaq turned to her, his expression raw with emotion. He's gonna make it. His voice was firm, but his chest tightened with fear. Doctors disappeared behind the operating room doors. The red in-surgery light flickered on. And now all they could do was wait. The minutes crawled by. Shaq sat in the waiting room, his massive frame hunched over, elbows on his knees. Rachel was beside him, her hands shaking violently as she gripped a rosary she hadn't touched in years. Every now and then, Shaq glanced at the double doors. No news. 1 hour passed. Then 2. Each second felt like a lifetime. Shaq checked his phone. Social media was still exploding with messages of support. Justice for Oliver was trending worldwide. Millions were praying for one little boy. But none of that mattered if Oliver didn't make it. Then, the doors finally swung open. A surgeon, still in scrubs, pulled off his mask and walked toward them. Shaq and Rachel shot to their feet. Rachel's breath hitched. "Please," she whispered. "Just tell me he's okay." The surgeon exhaled slowly, and for a second Shaq's heart stopped. Then, the surgery was a success. Rachel's knees buckled, and Shaq caught her just before she collapsed. Her sobs shook her entire body. "He made it?" she choked out. The doctor nodded. "He's stable. He's going to be okay." Shaq felt his entire body sag with relief. For the first time in hours, he let out a breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. Rachel pulled away, sobbing into her hands. She wasn't just crying for Oliver. She was crying for all the nights spent on the streets, for the years of helplessness, for the fact that, for the first time in a long time, her son had a future. Hours later, as Oliver rested in recovery, a nurse approached Shaq with a small envelope. "This is for you," she said softly. Shaq frowned, taking the envelope. It was written in childish, messy handwriting. The moment he saw the name on it, his breath caught in his throat. From Oliver. He carefully unfolded the letter. The words were shaky, uneven, written in blue crayon. "Dear Shaq, Mom says you're a giant, but you're also a superhero. If I don't wake up, tell Mom I love her, and tell you, thank you for saving me." Shaq froze. A lump formed in his throat as he stared at the words. His vision blurred. He gripped the letter tightly, feeling something inside him break open. This little boy, who had lost so much, who had been ignored and cast aside by the world, had still found it in his heart to say thank you. Tears rolled down Shaq's face, silent and uncontrollable. He wiped at them roughly, but they wouldn't stop. Rachel saw the letter and covered her mouth in a sob. Shaq swallowed hard and looked toward Oliver's hospital bed. The boy was still weak, his tiny chest rising and falling steadily. But he was alive. Shaq leaned down, brushing a hand gently over Oliver's head. When Oliver's eyes fluttered open, Shaq's voice came out thick with emotion. "I got you, little man." Oliver smiled sleepily, and for the first time since meeting him, Shaq saw something new in Oliver's face. Hope. The aftermath. Changing the system. 900 words. A warm breeze rustled the trees in the park as children laughed and ran across the open field. Among them, Oliver Carter sprinted across the grass, his tiny legs moving faster than they ever had before. Just weeks ago, he had been fighting for his life. Now, he was laughing, playing, alive. Rachel sat on a park bench, watching her son in awe. She still couldn't believe it. Her little boy had been given a second chance, and it was all because one man refused to look away. A familiar black SUV pulled up near the playground. Oliver's eyes lit up as soon as he saw the towering figure step out. "Shaq!" he shouted, bolting toward him. Shaq laughed, catching Oliver as the boy leapt into his arms. "You got faster, kid," Shaq said, grinning down at him. Oliver beamed. "I told you I was going to get big like you." Shaq ruffled his hair. "Still got a long way to go, little man." He reached behind him and pulled out a signed basketball. "For you," Shaq said. Oliver's jaw dropped. "No way." Rachel smiled, wiping away a stray tear as she watched Oliver cradle the ball like it was made of gold. For the first time in years, her son had a future, and she had something she thought she had lost forever: hope. But Shaq knew one thing. Saving Oliver wasn't enough. There were thousands of kids just like him. Ignored, turned away, forgotten. He couldn't let that continue. So, he did what he did best. He made noise. Using the media attention, Shaq launched the Carter Foundation, named after Oliver, to fund medical treatment for homeless children. Within days, millions of dollars poured in from donors, celebrities, and athletes who wanted to make a difference. "No kid should have to fight to stay alive," Shaq told reporters. The foundation partnered with hospitals nationwide, ensuring that no child would ever be denied surgery due to money again. Meanwhile, Dr. Kenneth Wallace, the corrupt hospital CEO, faced the consequences of his greed. The public demanded justice, and prosecutors delivered. Wallace was indicted on fraud charges, accused of embezzling millions from charity funds meant for sick children. The sentence? 20 years behind bars. When Rachel saw the news, she felt nothing but relief. Because for once, the system had worked in favor of the people who needed it most. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Shaq sat with Oliver and Rachel in their new, warm, cozy apartment. No more cold nights on the streets. No more begging outside hospitals. Just safety, comfort, and a future. Oliver pulled out a piece of paper and some crayons. Shaq watched as the little boy carefully drew something: 3 stick figures standing together. When he finished, he held it up proudly. It was a picture of himself, his mom, and Shaq. Shaq felt his chest tighten. "This is us," Oliver said. "Now we're a team forever." Rachel pressed a hand to her heart. Shaq stared at the drawing for a long moment, then smiled. He picked Oliver up and placed him on his shoulders. "Yeah, kid," Shaq said, looking toward the future. "We are." Oliver's life was saved, but the fight didn't end there. Shaq turned one act of kindness into a movement, ensuring no child is ever denied medical care due to poverty. Wallace faced justice, the corrupt system was exposed, and real change began. As Oliver laughed playing in the park, Shaq knew this wasn't just about saving one boy. It was about changing countless lives forever. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Stand up for those who can't fight for themselves. Share this video, spread awareness, and support organizations helping children in need. Hit the like button, subscribe for more powerful stories, and leave a comment. Every voice matters. Together we can make a difference.